This playthrough is rated T for teen.
Chapter 5, The Reward, Los Angeles, December 22nd, 1980, 10 a.m. Though the sun had risen outside the window, only faint wisps of its light made their way through the closed blind of room 202. The apartment was still dark, and the residents breathed heavily, evenly. Let's try that again. Chapter 5, The Reward, Los Angeles, December 22nd, 1980, 10 a.m. Though the sun had risen outside the window, only faint wisps of its light made their way through the closed blind of room 202. The apartment was still dark, and its resident breathed evenly as he slept. For the past few days, Hyde had thoroughly enjoyed the comfortable feeling of sleeping late into the morning, rather than setting an alarm. So when he was rudely awakened by the piercing ring of the telephone, his feeling of comfort was interrupted, and it put him in a rather bad mood. On top of that, the ringing kept going on and on, persistently, as if shouting at him to get out of bed. Straining, he reached across and picked up the receiver from next to his pillow. "If you need me for something, can't wait till later. Call me back when I'm awake," he spoke, with a voice that would instantly wake up anyone listening. He went to hang up, and then he heard a booming voice on the other end, and he realized for the first time that it wasn't Rachel that had phoned him. "Hyde, it's me." It was the disagreeable voice of his boss, Ed. "Real classy of you sleeping in this late. You're not so keen on working for me again after all?" Hearing Ed speak, Hyde immediately became completely alert. "Ed, wait!" he told Ed as earnestly as he could, that he knew he shouldn't be sleeping in this late. He admitted he was getting lazy and needed to regain his focus. In response, Ed told Hyde in his usual sardonic manner about the condition for rehiring him. He explained that in order for it to seem worthwhile, Hyde would have to pass the test of his sales ability. "It's like this. I want you to try selling some of your current inventory to the local residents." Both of them were well aware of how difficult it was to sell things to one's own neighbors. However, Hyde was determined to get his job back, so he had no other choice. While Ed was on the phone, he thought he'd quickly check about one other matter. "I just wanted to ask you about that order sheet." But Ed just told him that now wasn't the time to be thinking about other business. Hyde should focus on his real job, he said dismissively. "You're right," said Hyde. Ed sounded happy to hear it. He said to get in contact with him once he made some progress and then passed the phone over to Rachel. The first words out of her mouth were, "I'm sure you'll sell plenty." She asked Hyde if he was worried about Ed's test and then gave him some serious advice. "It's all about spotting your chance. You've got to find out what the people are after and give it to them." Hyde couldn't help but smile to himself when he heard those words. It was the exact same advice that Ed had given him 4 years earlier when he first became a salesman. Hyde knew exactly what reaction Rachel was expecting from him. Rachel never minced words with him, and she always stood by him to the last. She was more important to him than anyone else. "Meal's coming back from art college for the winter break," she said out of the blue. Mila Evans, so it's been a year. A memory stirred in his head, and Mila's face reflected in his car's rear-view mirror as it faced back towards Hotel Dusk. "How's Mila getting along with her studies?" he asked. He had first met Mila a year ago, doing the same kind of other business Ed was talking about on the phone. He had stayed at a rundown hotel by the name of Hotel Dusk. There was a long blank stretch in her memories. When she was a child, she got mixed up in something terrible and fallen into a coma, and she spent the next 10 years lying on a hospital bed in a deep sleep. Mila had no relatives to look after her. She was all alone. On the occasion that they first met at Hotel Dusk, they discovered the awful truth of her father's disappearance, including the reason behind it. Mila's only relative was gone, and when Hyde left to go home, he took her along with him. A vivid image of her face flashed in his mind. "I think she's come home so she can see you again," said Rachel. After a promise that she would call him as soon as Mila arrived, she hung up. Moving from his bed at last, Hyde went over to take a look at what he still had in his box of Red Crown inventory. There's some strong detergent, some wax, some adhesive, and what else? His face fell. It seemed doubtful that any of the other residents would want to buy these products. He was interrupted again by the phone ringing again. He hesitated for a second before picking up. "I've got enough to deal with already." The voice he heard through the receiver was that of his mother, Jeannie. "Kyle, are you taking the day off of work again?" She sounded quite concerned. She told him she had phoned Red Crown and they said he wasn't there. "Why are you calling work anyway?" he asked, annoyed that she was making such a fuss. Her response was an unexpected one. "I need to speak to Ed about something. I've got a call from the LAPD this morning. They decided to reopen Chris's case." Chris was the name of Kyle's father. She was referring to the investigation into his murder. The case was being opened again. It still all seemed a bit sudden, but she had thought it was worth letting Ed know about it. Ed had suggested that it might all be down to the mayoral candidate, Hugh Speck. He is a former LAPD officer himself and apparently made it his mission to combat organized crime. Jeannie had a reason for wanting to tell Ed in particular. Ed was an LAPD officer himself at the time Chris had died, and the two of them were good friends. Ed was also the one who had discovered Chris's body in the parking lot. When the police department swiftly decided not to investigate the case any further, Ed was the only one who came to apologize and offer his condolences to Chris's wife and child. Kyle, do you actually want to know the truth behind what happened to your father? Jeannie asked. Hyde knew what she meant. If this new investigation turned up any facts that shed some light on the whole incident, would he really want to know, all this time later? He considered it for a moment, and then answered in a measured tone. Even if the details revealed things he might not have wanted to know about his father, he felt it was his duty as a son to uncover the truth. His mother seemed satisfied with his response as she quietly ended the call. It occurred to Hyde that the last time he and his mother had talked about his father's death had been quite some time ago. As he mulled over the subject, he was less concerned with why the case had been reopened at this particular time, and more interested in whether his mother shared his desire to find out the truth no matter what. But Jeannie was the type of person to wear her heart on her sleeve, especially around Kyle. Ultimately, he decided that if she didn't want to find out, she surely would have told him so. Guess I should try and sell some of this crap, he said aloud to himself. It was time to take a stab at the challenge. Ed had set him. But thinking of Ed had just brought him back to his father's murder, and he started wondering about his mother's feelings again. He did his best to shake it off. The important thing right now was getting his job back. In all honesty, Hyde wouldn't generally have said he couldn't care less about who around him wanted but he had to ignore that part of himself. He figured he would be able to ask Tony directly at least. Hyde wasn't the most comfortable talking to his neighbors, but at least there was one person there he could deal with. Tony, is there anything bothering you right now? Tony reacted to this sudden visit and equally sudden question by contorting his face into a puzzled expression, and appeared to think more deeply than the question probably deserved. In the 4 years he lived here, this was the first time Hyde had ever come to talk to him as early as this, asking this kind of question. Hyde changed his tactic. What were you doing before I got here? He asked. He answered that he had been thinking about practicing the guitar, but he'd been given a pause when he realized his guitar was in need of a good polish. If only he had some guitar wax, he said, he'd be able to wow them at the audition he had coming up. A light went on in Hyde's head. It just so happens that I have some wax right here. It's a brand new product that's guaranteed to put the shine back. To tell the truth, Hyde actually knew very little about guitars, but he thought it was worth a try. I did it! I made a sale! He gave a sigh of relief. Later, Tony went to the audition with his newly polished guitar. Unfortunately, he didn't get it, but he got the feel that the judges were impressed with the shiny new, good-as-new guitar, if not his singing voice. Hyde went down to the lobby and just stood there, a little aimless. He wasn't sure who he'd approach. Just then he heard someone coming up the stairs from the basement. They were talking to themselves. That's put me in a real fix. It was Betty's voice. When she got up the lobby and noticed him, she uttered a friendly "Good morning." That couldn't hide her foul mood. Why the long face? He asked. Oh, is it that obvious? I'm not having a good day. He tried to get her to the library, but she just said not to worry about it and sped off. He was too intrigued not to know, so he went down to the laundry room to see if he could find out for himself. In one of the machines, he found a dress with a large stain on it. He felt certain he had discovered the cause of Betty's frustration. He raced to Betty's room as fast as he could and asked her about the dress. First, he clarified that he had just been concerned about how she was acting and had found the dress when he looked into the laundry room. Hanging her head, Betty confessed she had borrowed the dress from a friend and carelessly spilt a glass of wine on it. So it's a wine stain, huh? You might want to try some of this detergent I've got. It's extra strong. It'll get all kinds of stains out without damaging the material. Betty was eager to give it a try and took him up on the offer. It's $3 for the bottle. Definitely the cheapest way to resolve this without ruining your friendship. Betty took it without hesitation. Hyde successfully sold the concentrated detergent. He hadn't used any clever sales talk, but by his standards, it was a job well done. I did it! In the end, the dress cleaned up nicely, and Betty was able to return it to her friend without a mark on it. In fact, her friend was overjoyed. She thought it looked practically like a brand new dress. Betty hadn't expected the detergent to be quite so powerful that it removed older stains on the dress as well. While she was in the laundry room washing the dress, Betty thought about Hyde and the way he had looked at as he was trying his very best to sell her the detergent. She giggled to herself as the thought of someone as unsociable as him being a salesman. Hyde went and showed the snow globe he had in stock to Betty, who was in the laundry room. From the way she spoke, the snow globe clearly brought back some treasured memories. You know, looking at this reminds me of our first love. The first present I gave him was a snow globe just like this. Sounds like quite the love story. Betty smiled as much to herself as to Hyde. It was truly special. Sammy ended up cheating on me. You know, he said, the best Christmas decorations are the ones that remind you of the wonderful times you've had. Betty took him up on his offer and bought the snow globe. Hyde wished her a slightly awkward Merry Christmas as he took his payment. He wasn't good at those cheerful greetings. Just looking at the snow globe made the beautiful love affair come alive again for Betty. Holding it in her hands and gazing at the flurry of snow inside it had her feeling like she was a schoolgirl again, her heart racing from excitement. Above all, she would never forget the butterflies in her stomach she had felt every time she was around him. At last, Hyde had successfully completed Ed's assignment and hence proven that he was worthy of getting his job back. He went back to his room and hastily dialed Red Crown's number. "Congratulations, you're no longer fired," said Ed, who was never one to draw these matters out. Hyde breathed a sigh of relief. He could keep working there after all. Ed ordered him to come back to the office right away, but despite his tenuous position, Hyde felt compelled to ask for a favor. "Please let me stay here and work instead on coming back to the office." He explained that since he had accepted that order, he would greatly appreciate being able to work at home until he had fulfilled it. Ed couldn't understand it. 25 years was a very long time, no matter how hard he searched. Was it really likely that the Scarlet Star would turn up? But Hyde proposed that this was exactly why the order had come to him in particular. Whoever had sent it must believe that he was capable of getting to the bottom of it. Plus, if I can locate the item on the shorter sheet, I have a feeling it will reveal something useful about the events surrounding my dad's death. He admitted it was just a hunch, but he was sure it couldn't be a coincidence that he'd received this order just as his father's case was being reopened. He begged Ed to let him see it through. After a moment's pause, Ed finally relented. "From today onwards, that crummy apartment you call home is also your office." Ed inquired as to whether there was any information that would be useful to help him solve this mystery, and Hyde asked if he knew anything about Frank Raver. "Frank Raver? That name rings a bell, but I can't put a face to him." Hyde added some details. Frank was older than Ed and a former detective in the LAPD. He lived in the same building as Hyde, and despite being retired, he was investigating the unsolved murder case from 13 years ago, when Kathy McGrath, the wife of Hotel Cape's West owner, had been killed. Ed couldn't promise anything, but he said he'd call in some favors to try and find out more about this guy. When he got off the phone, he felt more at ease than he'd had in days. And now that he didn't have to worry so much about making sales to his neighbors, he finally noticed his stomach grumbling. As always, he headed to Lucky's Cafe. There's none of the customers in sight, so once again, he had the place all to himself. Claire greeted him as enthusiastically as ever, but Hyde could tell that she was feeling slightly emotional since the cafe was soon going to be knocked down, along with the rest of the building. "Hi, Claire. What's today's coffee?" "This straight man hailing. It's from Indonesia and has a distinctive aroma and a strong taste to match." Claire took his order and went back to the counter. Service with a smile, rain or shine. He sat down in his favorite seat. Sydney came over to say hello. The man spoke in a soft tone and with a sense of bitterness. "I wish we didn't have to shut this place up at the end of the month." Hyde could certainly understand his frustration, but he could say nothing to alleviate it. "After 12 years of slugging at it here, it kind of hoped it'd never have to move. If you add to that time I spent working at the hotel restaurant, it's 18 years in total." Sydney was finally letting out all these feelings that had been bottled up. Hyde asked Sydney what the hotel was like, and Sydney showed him a photograph from that era. It is an exterior shot of the hotel from 13 years ago. Sydney agreed to lend Hyde the photo for a while. "Hopefully both of us will have better luck in the new year." Hearing those words as he walked out the door, Hyde decided on a whim that he would wander into town instead of going back to his apartment. Everything was decorated in the festive spirit, and the throngs of people were doing their Christmas shopping. However, the hustle and bustle soon grew too much for him, and to get away from all the people, he snuck into a tiny cinema in a back alley. It was a movie he had seen countless times before, and it held a special place in his heart. It was a western about a mean-looking protagonist with a heart of gold saving a village from bandits. All the villagers loved him. At the end, the woman and the child he'd grown close to wanted him to stay, but he knew he had to move on. The film's protagonist had an imposing presence as he strode away from the village, his head held high. When viewed in profile, the actor reminded Hyde of his father. So many years later, it was impossible to know what, if anything, his father had been fighting against, but Hyde still had a vivid childhood memory of his father glaring out the window with the same expression on his face. By the time he left the cinema, the sun was setting and the streets were bathed in a warm glow. He returned to Cape West with the surreal feeling one gets after watching a long film and then returning to the outside world. When he arrived, he paused in front of the decrepit-looking building and stared up at it for a moment, intrigued by something he had spotted. Huh? There was a light on one of the fourth-floor windows. Who's there? Still brewing with suspicions, he opened the door and stepped inside. He immediately spotted a gentleman he didn't recognize walking down the stairs. The The man said hello, but Hyde wasn't prepared to be so casual just yet and asked straight out, "Who are you?" He introduced himself as Will White, the tenant in room 306. Now that he mentioned it, Hyde certainly felt like he had seen him around the place at least once before. "It's a shame you didn't remember my name," said Will, "especially since I know exactly who you are. You live in room 202, Mr. Hyde, right?" Hyde answered in the affirmative. He realized that it was really quite rude of him to have forgotten. Will then proceeded to talk non-stop as if Hyde was hanging on his every word. "I'm a salesman myself. I spend so much time away from here on business that it's no wonder most of the others in this building don't recognize me. You're in roughly the same situation, aren't you?" Hyde couldn't get a word in edgewise. I'd look forward to becoming a closer acquaintance with you," he went on. "But as you know, we're both about to leave this place. Looks like the most appropriate greetings would be along the lines of, 'It's a shame.'" Finally, Will asked his first genuine question. He was curious as to whether Hyde knew anything about why Max was selling the building. Hyde didn't have much to tell him. She just said that it's tough for one woman alone to run a place like this, not to mention the recent bout of trouble that's been happening. Will dropped the subject and left shortly afterwards. Perhaps he was satisfied with the answer. He certainly likes the sound of his own voice. He stood and watched Will as he left, but he had to remind himself that this whole conversation would cease to matter once he moved out. Suddenly remembering the light he'd seen in the 4th floor window, he went up to investigate. When he got there, he found there was indeed someone else inside. The fire door was open and the door to room 405 was ajar, and had a light streaming out of it. He poked his nose into the room and saw a man standing there, fading away from him. Without even turning around, the man said, "Is that you, Mr. Hyde?" Dylan had figured that there was no one else was likely to be coming up there. "Which reminds me, you took a look around up here on the 4th floor yesterday, right, Mr. Hyde?" Hyde answered that he'd only been in room 404. Dylan cocked his head. "Oh, I wonder who the culprit is then." "The culprit for what?" Dylan explained the situation. Room 306's Will White had made a complaint, and Max had asked Dylan to find out what was causing the problem. A complaint? According to Dylan, the complaint was about a sudden loud noise coming from the 4th floor that Will had heard in the middle of the night. It had seemingly been caused by a stand lamp falling over. Dylan mentioned that he wasn't Will's biggest fan. He was too nitpicky and quick to anger. Hyde agreed. Based on their one conversation to date, he didn't seem to get on that well with the man either. That's comforting," said Dylan. Hyde was rather perplexed by Dylan's remark. Dylan clarified that it simply meant it was comforting that they both felt the same way, and it wasn't just him being petty. He also explained that he'd actually quite wanted to continue the conversation he'd been having with Hyde before. What was it you wanted to talk to me about?" asked Hyde. Dylan said he'd been wanting to ask Hyde all about his time as a detective. Hyde said that he didn't really have anything exciting to share, but Dylan insisted that he wasn't the only one who was curious. Frank Raver from room 302 also wanted to know about Hyde's past. "That old-timer?" Dylan explained that Frank had once asked him what kind of guy Hyde was, and he had told him everything he knew, including how he had left the NYPD 4 years ago after shooting his partner. Hyde was not best pleased. He didn't like people spreading stories about his private life. Dylan appeared to have realized that he'd said too much and made a quick exit. But as he did so, something quite unfortunate occurred. Dylan closed the door with such a bang that the ancient doorknob fell off, leaving Hyde stuck in room 405. There was nothing he could do but frantically flick the light switch on and off as a makeshift signal. I just hope somebody notices. Eventually, the door swung open and Dylan was standing there. "I saw the light flashing up the 4th floor and thought I'd come to investigate." Hyde could tell from Dylan's eyes that he was quite amused by the whole thing. When you closed the door just now, the force must have loosened the doorknob. It fell off and I couldn't get out." But no matter how much he complained, he was more grateful than words that Dylan had showed up when he did. Dylan said he'd fix the doorknob later. Hyde thanked him and the two of them left the room. When Dylan was gone, Hyde whispered quietly to himself in the abandoned corridor, "These things keep happening. Makes me feel uneasy." He jumped in shock as his pager started beeping. He descended the staircase, but before he got to his room, he bumped into Tony, who was laughing to himself in the corridor. Hyde just thought, "What the?" "You sly dog, Hyde," said Tony, grinning wickedly. "I went to see you in your room, but instead I caught a peek of some hot chick coming to visit you." This was news to him. What kind of woman was it? Tony described her as being petite and slender with blonde hair. Apparently she stood outside his room about 30 minutes earlier, but she had run off as soon as much as Tony opened his mouth. Hyde ran back to his room as if his life depended on it. A note had been stuck on his door. It reads, "Missed you. I'll drop in another time. Mila." He sighed. She'd finally come to visit him, but he'd missed her. "I haven't had such great luck this evening." He took the note off the door and went inside. He was about to call Rachel when he noticed the light on the answering phone. He had a message. You must deliver the Scarlet Star to whoever is responsible for Kathy's death." For information on the reward, check under Table B in Lucky's Cafe at 7 p.m. today. I'm supposed to deliver to whoever's responsible for Kathy's death? What the hell is this, some kind of joke? The pager started beeping again. He felt like it was shouting at him for not responding sooner. He diverted his attention from the message and gave Rachel a call. He told her that Mila had come to his room, but he had missed her. Rachel was surprised to hear that she had been there. She must have gone straight to your place after arriving in L.A. Rachel said that she was just heading out to meet Mila now and passed the phone over to Ed. It seemed that Ed was the one who had paged him for a change. He explained that he had gotten in contact with a former colleague of his in the LAPD, the same one who had phoned Hyde's mother to let her know that the case was being reopened. He told him that the police department was planning a major crackdown on organized crime next year, and that part of it would involve digging up any major unsolved cases from the past. The LAPD believed that the death of Hyde's father was somehow connected with a crime syndicate. When his father's body had been discovered in the downtown parking lot 25 years earlier, it had already been at least 2 days since his death, and the body had been moved there from another location. However, there were no witnesses nor any clues left behind as to the identity of the killer. By searching the bag that was found on the scene, they had determined that the victim was Chris Hyde, a man with no criminal record. However, Ed's superior at the time had told him not to investigate. The case any further deemed such a minor incident to be a waste of police time. And then Ed told Hyde precisely who that superior was, Hugh Speck, the very same mayoral candidate who was spearheading this fight against organized crime. I can't believe that may have come to some sort of connection to Niall. In fact, the connection only has just become apparent to me. This was news to Hyde as well. He hadn't considered that the crime syndicate, the incident, was connected to might be Niall. The events that had taken place at Hotel Dusk almost exactly 1 year ago came flooding back to him. Bradley. Dad. Changing the subject, Hyde told Ed that he had found out in a manner of speaking, at least, who he was supposed to deliver the item requested on the order sheet to. Yeah? Well, who's the lucky person? I'm supposed to hand it to whoever was responsible for the murder that happened here 13 years ago. Kathy McGrath's murder. Hyde could hear Ed gasp on the other end of the line. They want you to deliver the item to the murderer in an unsolved case? That's what it sounds like. Ed felt uneasy about this. He was certain that the client wanted Hyde to do more than just find this missing item, that Hyde was supposed to cover the truth of what happened in the apartment building in the past. Of course, they still had only a vague idea of who had made the request. I'll call you if I find anything about Frank Raver, Ed said finally before putting the phone down. Hyde's doorbell made its familiar buzzing sound. It was Frank at the door, asking Hyde to return his tape and demanding to know how it came to be in Hyde's possession. Hyde simply replied that he had found it in the laundry room. Frank recounted the conversation he'd had with Tony the previous day. Tony had told Frank there was something important they needed to discuss and summoned him to the fourth floor. However, when Frank arrived at the allotted time, Hyde had been there instead. Hyde could verify the last part. He had definitely met Frank on the fourth floor. Frank hadn't ended up meeting Tony at all that night, but then Tony had come to his room the next day, asked him to forget all about the previous day's events, and said that Hyde was the one who had the tape. That man's thought processes are quite the puzzle, Mr. Hyde, said Frank, glaring at him with a dark scowl. Hyde commented reasonably enough that if he wanted to know what Tony was thinking, he would have to ask the man himself. Then Hyde admitted that he had taken the liberty of listening to the tape. Frank's expression remained exactly as it was. He must have assumed this already. Hyde poked and prodded as much as he could to find out why Frank was investigating the events of 13 years ago. But Frank cut him off with a, well, tough, it has nothing to do with you. Then he started muttering as if the rest was more for his own benefit than Hyde's. It seems you haven't been able to rid yourself of acute detective senses. Once you get the sense, you have to act. I saw the change in your eyes when you heard. This sense is more of a curse than a blessing. Then admonishing Hyde not to interfere with his investigations any further, Frank gave Hyde a photograph of a funeral, explaining that it was the funeral of the first person on the scene after a certain incident occurred. Be sure to avoid making contact with the people you see in this picture, he added. Frank spoke with such force as to be almost threatening. Nonetheless, Hyde asked him one last question that he'd remembered on the spur of the moment. What can you tell me about Condor? You mean to say you don't know what Condor is? Replied Frank with a patronizing smirk. Then he simply hammered his point home one last time. Leave my investigation alone. That's all I have to say. Then he was gone, leaving Hyde with the photograph. Hyde stared down at it. He recognized the people in it. They were Mary Reveg and Rex Foster. What could link them with the events of 13 years ago? No matter how much he thought about it, he couldn't make a connection. Whose funeral was that a photo of? Frank had said that it was the first person on the scene after a particular incident. He couldn't stop those words repeating in his head, but at this point, it was impossible for him to tell what Frank had meant. Ah, look at the time. The answer phone message had demanded that he go to Lucky's Cafe at 7 o'clock, and he intended to comply. He stepped out into the corridor. When he did so, he could hear a man's voice coming from room 203. That dress looks good on you. There was a pause when he couldn't hear the response. Then a woman's voice replied, I had a great time yesterday. After the voices stopped, someone came out of the room. It was Betty giggling as she said, I'll see you soon. The one she was speaking to turned out to be Rex of all people. I'll wait at the same shop as before, he replied. Once Rex had left and was safely out of sight, Hyde approached Betty. I'm curious about the guy who left your room just now. Betty answered that his name was Rex and that he was a regular customer at her store. Are you and he an item or something? Hyde asked her. They were, Betty confirmed. Hyde couldn't hold back from giving her a warning. This man was dangerous. You don't have to worry about me, Mr. Hyde. I know how to choose my men. Rex has a strong personality, isn't afraid to spend his cash, and knows how to treat a lady. Her expression told of a confidence in her own choices as a woman. He may be a bit rough around the edges, but he's lonely and is a sucker for the soft touch. Trust me, Mr. Hyde. I know what I'm getting myself into. I could wrap him around my little finger, but there's no way he could do the same to me. Lonely and a sucker for soft touch, eh? Doesn't that describe you, Betty? Betty went back into her room without dignifying the comment with a response. Hyde got to the cafe at last and took a closer look at the table mentioned in the message. There was indeed a letter stuck to the bottom of table B. He opened it and found a newspaper clipping and a note that appeared to have been written on an old typewriter. The note read, The reward for finding the item is the truth of 25 years ago. You'll find part of the truth included here. The newspaper article had a date of 1955 and said the following. On December 17th, early in the morning, a body was discovered in a downtown parking lot near the city hall. The victim was shot. After initial forensics checks, it was determined that the victim, a man in his 30s, bled to death after receiving a gunshot wound to the chest. The police believe that he was murdered elsewhere roughly 2 days before, that he was moved to the parking lot soon after being murdered. Hyde hadn't expected this. It was clearly an article about his own father's death. So the sender of this letter is trying to say that if I locate the Scarlet Star, I'll be able to close the case surrounding my dad's death. Looking closely at the typewritten letter, he noticed that the T's were slightly higher on the page than all the other letters. Hyde spotted Claire and went over to her. He asked her who had sat at table B that day. It showed him that only Charles and Dylan had done so. Hyde made a beeline for room 305 to pay Charles a visit. Hyde skipped the pleasantries and asked Charles straight away if he had stuck the envelope under the table in the cafe. Charles denied having anything to do with it and took offense to Hyde's accusatory tone. Do you have a reason to doubt what I'm telling you? Hyde recalled what Rex had said to him. You really do talk like a detective. You really do talk like a detective, Kyle. He scrambled to make up the ground he was quickly losing. No, it's not that at all. But do you mind if I just ask you one more question? I'd really like to know if you saw who sat at the table before you got there. It was Dylan, Charles replied. Hyde made his way towards room 304 to see Dylan, but he was distracted by Will, who had to be leaving room 306 at the exact time. Well, hi there, Mr. Hyde. This is the last place I expect to bump into you. What's someone from the second floor doing up here on the third? Will spoke as if they had little chats like this all the time. Wishing that Will would simply go away, Hyde laboriously explained that he needed to talk to one of the third floor residents. Tell me, Will replied. It wouldn't be Dylan from room 304 that you've come to see, would it? Will then proceeded to make an accusation that came as a complete surprise to Hyde. He said that Dylan's role as a repairman for Mags was all a pretense. He was using that trusted position of spying on the residents' coming and goings. I'd advise you to keep well away from him if you know what's good for you. Will left Hyde in a state of bewilderment and descended the staircase. Dylan appeared from his room almost instantly, which gave the distinct impression that he had been listening in on Hyde and Will's conversation, or trying to at least. He seemed awfully curious to pry the details out of Hyde. Dylan? Asked Hyde. Were you trying to eavesdrop again? Dylan didn't take kindly to this line of questioning and moments later retreated to his room, dumbstruck. But Hyde still had questions he needed to ask, so he persisted and called out to Dylan through the door. However, still being disagreeable, Dylan neither replied nor opened the door. Hyde shouted again, Damn it, Dylan! His loud voice prompted an appearance from Frank. Will you kindly keep the noise down? He complained, poking his head out of his door. You're just being a nuisance to everyone. I got business to take care of with Dylan, but he refuses to open the door. Dylan had evidently been listening in on this conversation as well, and since he finally now came out of his room again, Dylan gave Frank the excuse they simply couldn't hear that Hyde was there because his buzzer was broken, then took Hyde into his room. Why'd you decide to suddenly open the door and let me in? Hyde was too curious not to ask. Dylan provided a direct answer. He knew that Frank was a former detective and he didn't want to raise the man's suspicions. Hyde asked Dylan again if he was the one who had stuck the envelope to the underside of that table. No, I was there. It was there before I sat down, he said. Showing an interest in the question itself, Dylan pressed for answers of his own. Mr. Hyde, why are you so curious to find out who put that letter there? What's so important about the letter? But when Hyde played it down and said it was nothing to worry about, Dylan let slip an intriguing tidbit. I'm trying to say, did you receive a threatening letter as well? What? Hyde vaguely remembered thinking that someone might have been in that position, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Who's being threatened? And seeing the determination in Hyde's eyes, Dylan resigned himself and began to speak. The one being threatened was Max. First, she had received threatening phone calls, and anonymous letters and packages had started to arrive. Soon afterwards, Max decided to sell the building. It was only a coincidence that he'd found out about it. He happened to be in Max's apartments once when he received a phone call. It was a very brief call, but after it ended, she turned pale and her hands were shaking. It left no doubt in Dylan's mind what kind of phone call it had been. With a smug look about him, Dylan commented that he knew plenty about the secrets of Max's past. He insisted, however, that he had not sent Hyde any letters. Max, secrets, huh? Threats, the past, secrets? In contrast to Hyde, Dylan spoke as if he thought this was all good fun. I'll tell you about Miss Patrice's secrets, Dylan said. On one condition, though. You share with me what was in that letter you found. I'll think about it, said Hyde, dismissing Dylan's proposal. Hyde was certain, however, that something of great significance was happening at Camp West. It might have started long ago in some places yet unknown to him. In any case, there was no escape for Hyde now. He would have to see this through to the end, even if the events that were unfolding threatened to bring his whole world crashing down around him. Alright, time for the classifieds. Notes concerning Kyle Hyde, Part 5, Sources of Curiosity. It's normal for a child to be filled with curiosity. Everything around them is new and surprising, and from the moment they wake up to the time they rest their weary heads, they look at the world and ask, why? But as we grow older, we become less and less likely to wonder why things are as they are, despite the fact that there are still countless things in the world that are new to us. The reason for that isn't hard to deduce. By the time we are adults, we have internalized the technique of looking at something we don't understand and either pretending we didn't see it or pretending we knew all about it already. One might argue that everything that exists in our world is a product of our inquisitive natures, our curiosity to know why, to understand things that are new to us. But the truth is, everyone becomes gradually less likely to ask why as each year passes. It's particularly a problem for those such as myself, who engages in the production of creative works. In December 1979, I had fallen into a slump. Instead of looking at the world and asking why, I just sat with my head in my hands. That's the worst possible state for an author to find himself in. I was supposed to be working on the plot for my new work, but instead I just sat holding my pen and staring at my writing paper for hours as not a single idea sprang to mind. The one who pulled me out of that abyss was Kyle Hyde. It wasn't that he did anything for me in particular. He just happened to turn up at the same hotel I was staying at in an attempt to make myself right. The moment I met him, I knew there was something truly unique about him. Kyle Hyde was most definitely something new to me, something I didn't understand. If he was supposed to be a salesman, why was he constantly shirking his duty? If he was always around presenting a facade of indifference, how did he come to know so much about everybody? If he disliked children so much, why were children so fond of him? And if he never made any effort to flirt with women, why did they universally find him so appealing? Just a few short hours after meeting Kyle, my mind was overwrought with questions such as these that set the gears in motion, and soon enough my missing sense of curiosity returned in full force, and my enthusiasm for writing along with it. There's no doubt that if I had met him back then, I would be a very different person today. That's how strong of an impact our chance encounter made on me. Ever since then, no matter what experiences I have, my curiosity has not waned. It persists to this day. In particular, I expected that my curiosity regarding Kyle Hyde will remain strong for the rest of my life. Well, what does Kyle Hyde, who inspired my sense of curiosity, have curiosity towards? One of his neighbors, a musician named Tony Wolfe, recounted a story to me of an incident that gave a brief insight into Kyle's sense of curiosity. That totally reminds me of the day after he moved in. I got home real late at night, and there was these weird noises coming from his room, kind of like this painful grunting sound. I kept hearing it over and over again, so naturally I got a little worried and knocked on the door and asked if everything was all right. Turns out he was just unpacking, and that was the noise he made when he lifted any of his stuff up. I thought it was pretty funny. The dude had never realized he did it. He made that noise whenever he put a whole lot of physical effort into something. I had to laugh, you know. Then when I saw him the next day, he came over and told me he figured out exactly when he made that noise. It only happened when he lifted something heavier than 10 kilos or unscrewed a lid that was really stuck. Apparently, after Tony went back to his own room, Kyle investigated how much it was required on his part before he'd make that sound of exertion. He's a pretty weird guy now that I think about it. He looked so pleased with himself when he said all that to me. But Man, I knew from the moment he loves finding out crazy stuff like that. It's like his passion. And you know, he gets into some pretty surprising things sometimes. This one time he drank a bottle after bottle of the juice from the vending machine in the lobby, just so he could win the video game they had as this competition prize. I kinda laughed then too. Incidentally, what Kyle won by finding the right bottle cap was, more specifically, a handheld gaming device from Japan released in 1980. The game involved repeatedly hitting the enemies as they reappeared, and he found it so entertaining that he even showed it to Rachel, his colleague at Red Crown. And man, that's not all. One time the prize changed to a pink rabbit game, and he had to get that one too. He really went all out for it. I don't know if he's secretly a big fan of Pinky Rabbit or if he just gotten really into those little games, but one way or the other, when something catches his eye, don't expect him to drag him away too easily. I guess you wouldn't think he's the type just from looking at him, huh? And apparently, even after he had just long since grown tired of the game itself, the device found a home in Kyle's jacket pocket, and for a long while he used it in place of a watch.